Welcome to episode 4 of the Magic Hour podcast. I am joined by a full house today. I've got two co-hosts, Professor Andrew Leslie. Welcome back.
Thank you. Good to be back, Paul. It's been a little while.
It has been. Good to see you again. Ella Jenkins, welcome to you.
Thank you.
And today we've got a really special guest. Zora Artis is the CEO of Artis Advisory, a management consultancy specialising in alignment, brand, corporate and communication strategy that allows their clients to achieve strategic clarity and a competitive edge that brings in results. Zora was also previously the chair of the International Association of Business Communicators, a global network of communication professionals committed to improving organisational effectiveness through strategic communication. Zora, welcome to the podcast.
Well, thank you very, very much, Paul. Good to be here.
Amazing. It's we've got a few different areas that we want to cover off today, particularly talking about leveraging the power of branding for innovation, particularly in the food industry, the importance of strong brand identity, mission alignment, and how these aid in finding the right audience for your product. And I'm sure there's a few other areas that we'll delve into as well. We should also mention up front, you're a very experienced cultivated meat taste tester as well.
I had the pleasure of tasting the bao buns not too long ago, and I think, what was the word you used in?
Remarkably unremarkable?
Remarkably unremarkable.
Yeah.
I think it's on the back of the hoodies.
Oh, there you go. Well, I actually really enjoyed it. I didn't know what to expect. I didn't come with any preconceived notions of what the flavour would be like, what would the mouthfeel be like, any of that sort of stuff. And I had it and I thought, yeah, this is pretty good. Tastes good, smells good. It's got the right texture. Very happy. So a big thumbs up from me.
Excellent, thank you. I didn't mean to make this all about us, actually.
Not even the slightest.
No, we can move on from that. It would be great to hear, I guess, about your experience and your background as far back as you want to go, really, and to what led you to where you are today.
As far back as I want to go, well, there's a lot of years there, but professionally I kicked off in the tourism industry way back when. I won't even go there. And coincidentally sort of fell into branding. I left the tourism industry and got a job as an account manager at a branding agency, and the biggest client that we had was Adidas through 15 countries in Asia Pacific, and my job was to grow the business beyond Adidas. So I did that and ended up working my way up to strategy director across a whole range of different sorts of brands and businesses, lots of different sectors, ranging from some startups through to, definitely still ended up working on Adidas, but also other global businesses, also working in mining industry, with different types of products for mines, like industrial wear rubber. So very different from a brand perspective, working on Olympic Games, all sorts of things. And from there, I got poached to go across to a full integrated business in advertising, marketing, communications, PR, the whole bit, and was a strategy director for a number of years before I walked away and started my own gig for a number of years, worked across internal communications and other types of communication, quite a fair bit of that, working with different brands and with agencies, and then was asked to run an agency myself. So I ran a business of about 25 people for a number of years, and moved across to running Artis Advisory now for the last 5 years this year. And I also am a CEO of the Alignment People, which is another business that I run, which is all about making sure executives and teams are well aligned across organisations to create healthy and high-performing teams and brands and businesses.
Amazing. Had you always wanted to have your own agency? Was that something that you always wanted to do, or did that just evolve? Yeah,
that just happened. I think there's something to be said for serendipity. There are opportunities that come up, and it's be prepared to seize them and see where they take you. And I think that's a really good thing to do.
Amazing. I've got just one question to kick off, just on what you mentioned there, and it's a pretty basic question, really, and it's around obviously, large corporations are different to startups, and obviously a lot of that comes down to the budget. But how does the approach change in terms of branding and brand awareness from a small startup, as it were, to someone like Adidas? You would obviously have a massive budget and that sort of thing.
Well, even those that have a massive budget are still tight on the budget. They still try and make sure they can get the best ROI for the dollars that they're spending. So you're very conscious of budget all the time. With the startups, it's about being clear on what the brand's supposed to be about, and that's the same, whether it's an established brand or a startup brand. Being really clear on what is the brand stand for, what's the promise that you're making. What's the sort of personality that you want to have? What are the values that you're going to have or do have? And what's that experience you're going to create? And ultimately, it's looking at who your audiences are. So who are the people that you're trying to appeal to and attract? And as a startup, you need to make sure that you've got the right people on board, particularly from an investor perspective, and try and get them on board as well as the potential customers down the track, who are all the various stakeholders that you need to bring in. And when you're dealing with established brands, you're still considering stakeholders as well. And there's also, if it's a public company, you're also dealing with investors. So there's similarities across the board, but the key thing is to be clear on what your brand is, what it's about, what the experience is like, and what are the key associations that you want people to take from your brand, from the experiences that they have with your brand. So that's that positioning piece. So really being able to hone in on positioning is really important, rather than trying to spread yourself across too many things, because then that gets muddled, and it doesn't become easy for people to understand what you're about and to differentiate you from others in the market.
I've just got one follow-up question to that, and then I'll hand over to Andrew and Ella. But when it comes to defining your brand strategy, obviously they should hire Artis Advisory, but outside of that, I'll offer some tips for everyone listening. What's the best way to go about defining your brand strategy? Do you get your team or your leadership team in a room and, workshop it? Do you go out and survey your customers or your potential customers? Like, how do you just go about defining it if you were, just looking at getting started?
Well, yes, you should hire someone like myself to start with, but you really need to be clear about what you're ultimately trying to achieve. So what's that success look like? Get the right people in the room and actually have everyone talk about what does success look like for us, because that's really important. Otherwise you could be, going off in different areas and, you won't get agreement on what the brand's going to be about ultimately. So there's that you have to do. You have to clearly identify who the potential audiences are, your stakeholders that you need to involve, what's that going to look like, that sort of stuff. Think about the research that you need to do. So anytime you do strategy, it should be informed by insight. So, and that insight comes from the research. So, whether it's you need to do a competitive analysis, have a look at what's happening in the market as well, so you're clear on that. But they're also looking at what people who could be your potential customers might think. What do they think, feel, do? So if you understand the current state, then you're able to take them to the future state. So that's an essential thing. So understand what that's like to start with, and so you can come up with key insights. So you'll have potential customer insights, you'll have business insights, and then you can work out what's that essential thing that we need to. What's going to be our brand truth? So you need to understand what that is. When you're doing you do workshops, yes. So to develop the brand strategy, so the essential elements, so everyone agrees on it. You're looking at things like, what are the core attributes? What are the things that, if it's an existing brand, what are the core things that have made us great to start with? What are those things that we can easily talk about? So they're those strengths, things that you can leverage. If you're a startup, it's like, what are those things going to be? What are we actually able to deliver on? Then you're looking at the different elements from a relationship perspective. So functional and emotional elements. You know, if someone's going to have a relationship with you from a brand perspective, whether that's an investor, a customer, employee, what does that look like? What are those things? Then you're thinking about things like your personality. So that means that what's your tone of voice going to be? And you need to be quite clear on that. You can't have too many characteristics, so no more than 3. Otherwise, you become schizophrenic and you can't do all of those things at the same time. And everyone needs to understand tone of voice because everyone is communicating everyone in the organisation needs to understand that because they're all communicating. And then what are those values, the behaviours? And ultimately, what's that key promise? What's the promise supposed to be? Because it's the promise that you need to deliver on each time. So this brand is not just about, so that's all the strategic stuff, and then you have to decide where are you going to target, where are you going to play, what are the value propositions going to be for the various customer segments or the various stakeholder segments you're dealing with. And then you're looking at your communication piece and what does the identity need to be and all that sort of stuff. So there's lots of components to it. So brand is not just about... Brand is the perception that you create in people's minds, and you can't control it, but you can influence it. Mm-hmm. Branding is the process to create that brand, and that does involve the strategy, but it also involves all the various touch points where your brand can appear. It involves your visual identity, so your logo and all the supporting sort of graphics that go with it, the photography, all of that sort of stuff, your tone of voice. All of that sort of thing is part of the branding process, and that you can control, but you can't control the brand per se.
Fascinating. Yeah, it's so in depth in terms of branding and brand strategy, and I think it's difficult for a lot of small business owners or startups to get their head around it, and I think they also probably struggle determining which is more important to focus on. Obviously, people often get confused between marketing and branding. So like marketing their products or their services, and then branding and the difference between the two, but also having the resources of what to focus on. So I mean, that's fascinating insights.
Yeah, and you will find that when you're starting off, you're trying to do everything.
Yeah.
And you're doing it with a small budget, small staff, all of that sort of stuff. So you have to spread yourself across everything. And sometimes you will find people who really believe in what you do, and they'll do things at, a special rate or whatever it is, and that will be really useful, and that helps. But ultimately, there is an investment that needs to be made, because at the end of the day, the brand it's an intangible asset. You look at organisations that were once startups, you think of one that was started in the garage, like, Apple. The key to that, the differentiator for that brand is design. It's beautiful design. And that was decided way back. That was really, really important to Steve Jobs, and he really understood design. And even the elements that you can't see are still beautifully designed within your iPhone or in your Mac or whatever it is. There's a lot of attention going to that because that's what they're about. So they genuinely understand what they stand for.
Yeah, and I guess the tangible outcome of having such a strong brand is that then you don't have to spend much on marketing because your brand is known, and then you develop that brand loyalty, and people are just going to go and buy an Apple product because I buy Apple products.
Yeah, I mean, they still spend money on marketing, but you don't have to do as much work on it, and you have your brand loyals doing some of the work for you as well. So you've got others doing the work, and you will have, when people love your brand, they will talk about it. It's like the two brands that come to mind at the moment that are quite popular are Frank Green and Stanley, and they're those drink cups. And look, both of them have just grown incredibly, and it is through smart marketing that their brands have become really, really strong. But you're finding that lots of people are talking about them on social. So then that has that multiplier effect. So there was an element of serendipity there, but there's also smart marketing in terms of identifying the opportunity and then running with it.
It's interesting that you mentioned social there because obviously people can talk positively about your brand, but they can also talk negatively about your brand. Do you have any suggestions around, is all publicity good publicity? Is people just talking about your content on social media, or is it good, and will it generate, or do you need to moderate that? Do you I know you said you can't control it, but do you have any insights into that?
Many, many years ago when I did my undergrad degree, I remember Tourism Tasmania's Director of Marketing coming in and speaking to us in the marketing class. And there was negativity around some stuff that was happening in Tassie at the time. And we brought it up and he goes, all publicity is good publicity. And I don't agree with that anymore at all. You think about some of those brands or organisations that have had some really bad experiences and it hasn't been good, so they have to go into damage control. And that's where there's the communication and PR professionals come into play. They're the ones who are really looking at how do we manage reputation. I did a piece of work not long ago that started off with negative comment that just exploded on social media for a particular organisation, and that then led them to say, actually, we need to have a reputation management strategy, which is what I worked and developed for them with some others. And it involved repositioning the brand, and it was all through the tone of voice and how they then behaved on social. Because when they were engaging with their audience through community, so it was not it's not a product brand per se, it's a service brand. When they were engaging with their audience, there was a lot of negativity and they had to understand how they were going to respond. So they had to do it with a particular type of humour to a degree, but also with authority. So they had to know how to respond exactly. And in that case, we looked at what are the potential issues that could arise through social. Have a look at that. And so you're looking at scenario planning and you're looking at risk analysis and you're going, okay, so these are the sorts of things that could potentially happen. This is how our brand should respond. So we've preempted what those are going to be. So then when it happens, you're much better positioned to be able to respond to it. So, you will understand whatever sector you're in, what are some of the issues that are happening. You need to have your finger on the pulse in terms of what are the trends that are out there, what are the external factors that could potentially impact our brand and what we do or impact our sector, and then be able to respond to it. So you need to be prepared before it becomes a crisis.
Yeah, great advice. Great advice.
I think it's really great. I'm really enjoying the content that you're giving us today, Zora, and your long and broad experience. I'm just wondering if you can give us an example of a potential client or a client that you've had that they've given you a brief and you've gone, oh crap, where do I start? And how that worked out and what's the process you go through there?
Oh crap, where do I start? No, well, actually, if I think about it, the reputation management strategy was one because I hadn't written a reputation management strategy before. I have for years worked in issues and crisis and brand and communication and all of that sort of stuff, but I hadn't necessarily thought that this is what I'm about. And you apply the same sort of process. You apply that strategic thinking. So what's the business issue you're dealing with? So whether it's brand or something else, what's the business issue you're dealing with and how can brand communication and marketing help that. What are the objectives that we need to deal with? What are the key issues? What's the stakeholder analysis we need to do? Let's determine the overarching goals. What are the metrics going to be for the objectives and how we're going to measure them to assess how we're going to go? And then, what's that direction that we need to take from a strategic perspective? And then, tactical planning and all that sort of stuff. So initially I probably thought, I haven't done that, but do I think I can't? No, I didn't think that, because I knew I have the experience to do it. So I got that. I remember actually during COVID years, so I know that's a triggering thought for all of us, particularly from Melbourne, but during the COVID years, I worked on a playbook. And so I was contracted to do some work with the Department of Health and Human Services at the time, and we were responding to COVID-19. And I did the strategic communication plan for the department for the response for COVID. So that's the overarching strategic framework for it. So as simple as you can get it, that would apply across the whole department. And from that point, I was asked, can you create a playbook for communication and community engagement in response to outbreaks? So, this was in the second wave, and I said, okay, has anyone done one before? And no. So that's what I did. And I did it with a number of different people. I looked at where all the community engagement was happening across the whole department, across all of Victoria, and there was a lot of it. There was a lot. And so that playbook was developed, and that became the playbook that was used by emergency management at the state emergency level. And we used that in Shepparton when there was the big breakout, and then in the northern metro area when there was the breakout from a hospital that then in the northern suburbs.
Aged care.
Yeah, and that worked really well. So schools and all of that. So it did work. But that was one of those moments, and I was really proud of the impact that it had because it did work.
That's fascinating. As you were speaking, I was thinking back to a couple of months ago when you so kindly sat in on a panel for us for a food hack event, talking about the branding of food. And one of the things you said that night really, really stuck with me. And I'll probably get the saying wrong, but I think the intent is the importance of being able to do what you say. No, so being able to, saying something and then being able to do it.
Yeah, so don't have a say, do go.
Yeah, that's it.
Yeah. And that's where the reputation piece comes into it. So a lot of people confuse branding with making things look good, sound good. You do the pretty stuff, which is really underestimating how important the work someone like Ella does. And it's not about that. It's making sure that what you say actually is how you behave and the activity that is behind it. It's like when people create values in organisations and they put them on the wall and they think that's enough, but it's not. You have to genuinely live and breathe it. So are you genuinely embedding all of that? So when it comes to brand, one of the pieces of strategy that I do is a section called Brand Pillars. And that's really determining what are the things that we can genuinely talk about over a period of time. And you look at it from, year 1 through to however many years you want to go. So say year 3, year 5. And not every element that you've got in there, so these are the things that you genuinely believe in and can talk about. Not every element of those can you actually talk about in the first year because you need to develop the systems and processes and policies and whatever, or products or whatever, services, to be able to deliver on it. So you wait until you can genuinely talk about it. Otherwise, it becomes an issue of trust in the market. There was an example years ago when Rio Tinto had various values that they talked about. They were on their website, they spoke about it all the time, and then they blew up Juukan Gorge, which was an Indigenous site. So they didn't even think about that. They just did it. So it was completely contrary to what their brand was supposed to be about and what the organisation was about. And that was a problem. And now that's all changed. The chairman, CEO, the global head of corporate affairs, all of those people who were supposed to be responsible for engagement as well, they all lost their jobs. And they should.
And the gorge didn't get unblown up.
Well, it shouldn't have been blown up.
So how important do you think it is for new startups, because we have listeners who have their own startups, how important do you think it is to start the branding process early on in the business journey? And how much focus do you think should be put into it? And what stage do you think people should start thinking about what their values are and actually putting that into a branding strategy?
I think it's important to do it early, because otherwise what you get is you'll get a lot of information that's being put out into the market and you're trying to cover everything, but there is nothing that's really concrete and clear. So your positioning, the associations people have in their head when they think of your brand, you need to get to that point, right? But if those associations aren't clear, those core things aren't clear in their mind, and you haven't determined what they are, then I think you're just wasting a lot of effort. So you haven't got enough money to start with. So be wise about what you're going to spend it on. So determine what are those core essential things that you need to have in place from what your brand stands for, even if you just have a simple logo and all that sort of stuff. But you have to understand what those things are to be able to talk about it, to be able to behave in the way that you need to, so you can have your value proposition worked out. All of those sorts of things are really important. So do it early. And as you grow, you're going to need to go back to it and revisit it, because what you've set up at the beginning for your brand isn't necessarily going to stay the same over the years. So you will have to go through rebranding exercises down the track.
And what do you think should prompt rebranding? Like, what are the most important things to take into consideration when thinking about rebranding, and how much should a brand change?
Oh, that's a good question. I've been doing that with a few clients lately. It varies. It could be a major change of direction. Could be a merger and acquisition. Could be, that your brand is quite dated. It no longer fits. There's a whole series of reasons why you could potentially rebrand. And there's costs associated with it. So you have to think about how you do it. And it doesn't always involve a new logo, for example. It might be an evolution of what you're about, or it could be a tone of voice change, like the one I was talking about for reputation. That was basically a shift in tone of voice, how they talked about themselves and how they responded to people, but also how the people within the organisation communicated. So they all had to be trained because they had to completely shift, because it was an internal issue in how they communicated that caused the social media problem in the first place. So it could be all of those things. You might just do a shift in your visuals that goes with your brand, but your logo still stays the same. Could be just a minor thing, but you're constantly working on it. You see some of the large brands, like drink brands, like a Coca-Cola, for example. They do adjustments. They don't do wholesale change, but they do adjustments. You know?
I think one of the things that came to mind while you were talking about changing visual identity was, and you guys correct me on this because I'm not sure if my memory on it is right, but I think it was Impossible or Beyond. I'm pretty sure it was Impossible that went through a change recently with their packaging.
Yep.
And it's interesting how it changed from, in terms of like food, how the visual identity has changed from targeting like a nature, plants, healthy, vegetarian, sustainable kind of perspective to more of like, I think it was their burger packaging, to more of like those red colours rather than green, and something that's more about like finding an appetite in customers who want to eat this just because it's tasty rather than because it's sustainable or because it's vegan. And I think that that's interesting. That's an example of branding or visual identity changing based on what they think consumers are more likely to buy into in terms of what value it gives them.
Yeah, they went from green to red, basically. Yeah. It's really interesting. How much does psychology play into your branding strategy and your visual identity? Because I know a lot of people talk about, different colours evoke different emotions and all of that sort of thing. So how important is that to take into consideration?
It's quite important. There's the colour wheel and there's psychology behind the colours. I'm not the creative director or anything like that, but I've been around in that space for quite a long time, and I know that it does impact it. But there's a lot to be said about behavioural science in terms of how people think and how they might respond. And if you don't actually understand behavioural science, then you're not really going to get to behaviour change. So you use behavioural science techniques all the time in marketing and communication to get people to do something the first time, last time, more of or less of. It's basically the 4 key things. Many years ago, I was taught around strategy they're the 4 things. It doesn't matter whether or not you're going to start talking about advertising, PR, or social, or whatever it is. All those different sorts of ways of going there, of reaching an audience. It's like ultimately, what do you want them to do first? It's one of those 4 things. And in case of, say, a cultivated meat product, you probably want people to try it for the first time. And after that, you'll want them to do more of it. And that's what the Impossible Foods, they probably had people try it for the first time. They might have seen a change in sales over time, or there was some sort of particular trend that was impacting the market. So they're thinking, okay, where's our next audience? And the next audience could potentially be people who are meat eaters but just want to try something different. So then they had to adapt.
So is it more about finding the right audience than encouraging the same audience to come back in that case with rebranding?
It depends. It depends. You really have to understand your audience, and you need to make sure that you're continually researching and talking to them and listening to them. Because you don't want to lose. You've put in so much effort into attracting a particular audience, you don't necessarily want to lose those unless it's a massive shift for your organisation and you're going in a completely different direction. So don't lose the ones you've already got. You need to find more.
Makes sense.
I think the alternative protein space is really interesting, whether it's plant-based or cultivated meat or precision fermentation, in that in terms of day-to-day operations, we're all tech companies, we're all food tech companies, but we are developing a food product, which is very emotional for people, their food choices. And I think it's often quite difficult, in a tech business to also be adept at storytelling. But when you're developing a food product that people are emotional about and developing a brand around that, that's a really key component. Do you have any tips around how people can get better at storytelling with their brand, whether that's in the food industry or outside?
Coincidentally, I'm running some workshops with a client
there you go.
on brand storytelling. So storytelling works when it's done with intent. So we all tell stories. It's just natural. It's a human thing that we do. But we have, when we're considering it for a business purpose, we need to think about it from the perspective of what's that core message that we need to get across, and not ramble with the story. And it's got to be relevant. So you find that those stories that work really well are the ones that come from experience. So there are I stories, we stories, they stories. So an I is your own personal experience. That a we story is one where you've experienced it with somebody else, and a they is like a third-party story. So there will be stories those experiences that you can bring in and then tie to a core message that relates to whatever the brand is about, or whatever the key thing is that you want to talk about, some particular emotional connection. So that personal story might be about something to do with food, but it might not. So it could be about doing something for the first time. And, that maybe there's that sense of excitement and anxiety that you have at the same time, and you're trying to deal with it and balance it. And what's the lesson you got from that? And then how do you apply that to this? So there's ways to do it. So there's particular structures, and you try and keep them quite short. And that's the sort of thing that I teach. But when it comes to brand like this, it's about getting the right stories shared. So it would start with the people who work in the organisation, but then it's also about getting others to tell the stories for you. There's an alcohol brand, and I know that some of us here aren't drinking alcohol for various reasons, but, I don't mind a gin and tonic. And there's a particular gin called 4 Pillars. And 4 Pillars started on crafting story before it even sold a bottle. So, and now, they're 8 years old or whatever, and they've been the world's best gin, voted the world's best gin numerous times. And so it was a storytelling, story doing, and story farming, right? So there's different aspects of it. So storytelling is you sharing a story. The story doing is actually delivering on the promise. So it's like when you're talking about, let's have a food tasting experience. So we're going to tell the stories from that experience. What are those like? And story farming is when you're looking at other people doing different things around in your space and recognising and bringing those stories into it. So there are lots of ways that you can actually use story, and it's one of the most effective ways to create the emotional connection and for people to remember what you're about, more so than any data and facts. I think they say a story is remembered 22 times more than a fact.
Yeah, well.
So if you can connect the two, that's how you would do it.
Yep. Yeah, it's fascinating. Andrew, did you want to jump in?
I think I'm perseverating on the say-do gap, and it's just so important. And in our business, the sustainability angle of what we're doing, there's the real potential for creating impact, but we're not there yet. So I guess how long a gap between say and do is allowable. One of the things we're doing at the moment is through the Google Startups for Sustainable Development, we were accepted into a program, and they're putting us through an impact academy where we have to put together smart goals that we can measure on a yearly basis around sustainability. And it's a really interesting exercise in terms of looking at what we can do and what we can quantify as we're building up towards a revenue producing company. So do you have some comments around that length of time between what you say you can do and when you can do it?
Well, I think I would talk about the say-do. I would adjust that to do say-do. So the initial do that you're going through that process now is something that you can talk about, but you can talk about vision. But you have to create trust, you have to show there are three things, right? So there's a model called the trust triangle, which is a model by Francis Frey and Morris, who are amazing. They've got a great podcast. You should take a listen. But the model is 3 things. So authenticity, robustness, and empathy. So authenticity is you're being you, you're being transparent, that which comes into play with understanding who you are, who you genuinely are, and putting that out there. The robustness is the strategic plan, that strategy, do they think it's really going to work? Does that make sense? So it's logic is the term that they use. So do you have the logic? So is your plan going to get you there? So that's where what you're doing now, in terms of all the groundwork that you're doing, makes sense, but you have to show that plan. So you have to get that out there. And the empathies that you're showing that you actually care. So it's the care and the compassion. So the care for animals, the care for the environment, the care for people. So putting all of that out there is important. So the gap, it can't be that, the length of time shouldn't be that long, because you need to show progress.
Yeah.
And if you have a stumbling block, that's okay. Show that you've had a stumbling block and what you've learnt from it. That's absolutely okay, because that comes into the authenticity piece. But you're still working on that, the logic piece, the plan to get there.
Thanks, Zora. I think that's super useful. I feel like we've done a sneaky workaround to not pay you to give us advice, to ask you on our podcast.
That's quite funny.
That's in terms of our transparency.
That's absolutely okay.
Yeah, I think it is really important with this technology, and we did touch on this at the Food Hack panel, to we always make an effort, especially in our social posts, to be talking about the potential and at scale, and not be saying this is cheaper than real animal meat right now, but this has the potential to be cheaper than traditionally farmed animal meat in the future, and the importance of making that distinction and not setting unrealistic expectations, and also things that sound ridiculously too good to be true can often drive people away more than anything. And we get a lot of people who are very skeptical. How can all of this be, so good and so ideal, but it's not everywhere yet? And it's because the technology is not at scale yet, and these things aren't fully at their full potential right now, but there is potential in the future, definitely. Yeah.
So think about, what's the analogy? What are you comparing it to? What's something that was like that once before? Electric cars.
Yep, spot on.
Yep. So, by 2035 we're all going to be in an electric vehicle, apparently. Don't know.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of similarities between electric vehicles. And we talk about that a lot, particularly in not just in terms of the technology development, but the consumer acceptance. And, electric vehicles have been around for a very, very long time, but then Tesla came along and made them sexy and aspirational and had all these, additional gadgets and everything, where it just became the obvious better choice for someone that wants to choose a car. It wasn't just about it being sustainable or an electric vehicle. It was like, this actually goes faster and, this is cooler, et cetera, et cetera. And I think there's probably a lot of parallels in terms of, cultivated meat and what we're doing in terms of, developing just a better product, as opposed to relying on, it's more sustainable or it's more ethical, et cetera, et cetera. But it also brings up another interesting point as we're talking about sustainability. And I think my impression is that people are a little bit sick of hearing about sustainability claims from companies. And I guess the term that's used is greenwashing, and people, even as it relates to a green visual identity and moving away from that. Do you have any thoughts or insights around, greenwashing, or also misinformation and disinformation that comes out, particularly in social media?
Yeah. I still go back to that reputation management thing, because that was a lot of it was about misinformation and disinformation, and it's actually probably the scourge that we are of society right at the moment. Just if you think about politics and just what people think and believe, a lot of it comes down to that.
Yeah.
So it's really, really problematic. Greenwashing, green hushing, various terminologies are being used lately. I was at a company directors lunch not that long ago, and that was the topic of discussion. So at board level, it's a really important piece, because ESG has been, around for quite a while, and people are jumping on the bandwagon. And, when we're looking at the UN sustainable development goals as well. It's not just about your reputation, but it's actually, are you actually doing something about it, and why are you doing it? So you need to think about, how does whatever you're doing relate to your values? There is no point talking about sustainability if it's not genuine. Again, it comes back to that authenticity.
Yeah.
If it's not genuinely being done in the business or by the brand. So you shouldn't be talking about it if that's not the case. Don't just, go green because you think it's going to sell more.
Yeah.
If you can't prove it, because you'll get called out, and you'll get called out on social media. And I think I might have spoken about this when we did the food hacking event. There is that concept of glass box brands. So people can see into what's happening in the business. And the reason they can see is because of the connectivity that we've got and the transparency. So it's got the radical word in front of both of those, and that's thanks to social media and everyone's access to it. But it's also the fact that people within businesses will speak up if they're not comfortable.
Yeah.
So we've seen that recently in various organisations happening, where employees are not happy with whatever the decisions are being made at company level, and they act out, or they will share, and there will be a response back.
Yeah, trust is a fascinating issue. I mean, obviously talking about, politics and government, and then obviously even through, COVID and the pandemic, and even before that, just with, mainstream media, I think trust has been lost by the general population in terms of what they believe and who they listen to. And even like trying to, build a business or a brand in that environment is really challenging. Do you have any other tips around building trust, the importance of, I guess, of, developing a community, and using transparency and education, which are two things that we try and do in terms of our process, in terms of building that trust with the potential end consumer? Is there anything that comes to mind in terms of, just some general tips, I guess, around how you can go about building that trust? And is building a community, so is that a worthwhile activity for a business?
Building community is certainly worthwhile. It depends on what stage you're at, I think, and how much the resource that it takes to do that. But the 4 Pillars one, for example, they did build the community early, and it worked really well. It has worked really well for them and continues to work really well for them. So their brand stands out in terms of what they've achieved, and people are prepared to pay a premium for it, so they don't need to discount, whereas other brands do.
Yep.
So, and even if there is a discount occasionally, it's very minor, so you don't expect that, and that's the value of brand. So, Apple hardly ever discounts. They don't need to do that. So community, yes, through trust, through, engagement with them, understanding them, showing that you're there for them, and being genuine, so not just jumping on the bandwagon whenever you see something going on there. So being quite clear. You see often there could be various social issues that happen around the world, and brands sometimes jump on board and they do it badly. Because it becomes obvious, especially if they're doing it and they're, if you think of, say, footwear manufacturers, sports footwear manufacturers, when they jump on, and talk about, being good for the community, yet their products are created under, slave labour, basically. Yep. And, those sorts of things just don't work. So you have to be really quite transparent about that. So building community, yes, absolutely.
Really interesting. I think we might be running out of time now. So thank you so much for joining us. It's been so interesting hearing from you, and I'm sure it's so valuable for our listeners who have their own startups as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you. I really appreciate coming in and having a chat to you.
Yeah, it's been great. Thanks, Zora. We should also give a plug to our new Instagram page for the podcast before we go. It's the Magic Hour _podcast on Instagram.
On Instagram.
So that's our own little plug. But Zora, where can our listeners find you as well? You know, if you're obviously given some fascinating tips and insights today. If they want to engage you in terms of advisory, helping them build their brand strategy, how do the listeners find you?
Well, I'm very easy to find on LinkedIn. I think I'm the only Zora Artis on LinkedIn. So
Very good.
It's easy to find me, or you could go to artisadvisory.com and find me there.
Excellent. Thanks so much, Zora.
Thank you.
Thanks, Zora. That was great.